The first question to Amy Tan. Could you please introduce your husband to us?
My husband's name is Lou DiMattei. He really is a tax attorney, and he's not like any of the terrible men characters in my book. He has a wonderful sense of humor, and he's, over the 25 years we have been together, 26 years we've been together, he has become Chinese.
Question. Could you please explain why your half-sister in the 100 Secret Senses is depicted as a Hakka?
Ah. Well, she's not my half-sister. She's Olivia's half-sister to begin with. So it's not to confuse my half-sister, who is really from Beijing. I chose a Hakka because, as I was mentioning, all these things would come in my life, and I wanted to use an interplay with elements that had surfaced, and then I simply put them in. And at that time, everything was coming up Hakka. The food that I was eating, people that I was meeting, had conversations with people from China who had met some people who were Hakka. And pictures that I would see that fascinated me were always Hakka people. So I decided that I would make this person a Hakka. As it turned out, most people think of Hakkas as those living in Hong Kong or in the Fujian province, and that they are fisher people. But although I made these people Hakka, I was worried that it was not accurate, that in that part of China there were no Hakkas. But as I found out quite happily, the Hakkas, who it means guest people, they're displaced people who left the north of China and went down to the south. It turned out that they had settled in this area called Thistle Mountain, and that the son, the heavenly king, who thought he was the son of God, was himself a Hakka. So it all came together quite nicely for me.
Someone writes here, are you ever afraid that when you release your prose onto the page, that your faults, what you fear is true about yourself and your life, is made permanent and real?
No, I don't think of books as being my life transformed into a static document. The book is its own entity. It is, again, the characters don't represent me. I represent the characters. So it's their lives that remain there on the page and only continue in the imagination. My life continues and evolves and grows. I don't think of myself as revealing faults so much as thoughts. And so it's of course, maybe a delusion that, people aren't looking at that and saying, oh, she had a fight with her husband and said these things to him. I don't think of myself as giving away those parts of me that I consider very private. No, I want to emphasize that when I create fiction, the things that I put into my fiction is not representative of my life. They are elements of my life that have been transformed and transposed to fit the questions.
Right. Final question, I think. You describe the inflated inner tube in the doldrums as the spiritual malaise of the jock Dr. Eric. By mentioning a spiritual malaise, you must have an idea of spiritual well-being. Have you in fact defined this for yourself? And is the 100 Secret Senses a quest to define the eternal meaning of love, hope, truth, and life?
Wouldn't we all like to know that answer? I could make a lot of money if I had that answer. I think about spiritual well-being almost every day. I think that my job as a writer is really to think about those things that you might call spiritual, about one's life, your connection to the world, the larger world, other than yourself. And yes, and I'm sort of reluctant to actually say what I think it is, because there's this tendency for people to listen to what others have to say as their definition. And as a writer, the importance of what I'm doing is so driven by myself. And the answers that I find are so specific to me and my circumstances. I would never want anybody to take a generalization and say, well, this should apply to my life as well. Just as in my book, The 100 Secret Senses, I wouldn't want you to think that it's a book trying to convince people that there are ghosts or past lives. It is really to ask yourselves the question, what do you think love is? What do you need from love? What is unconditional love to you? And if there are things that exist beyond your ordinary senses, how would you define those? For me, The 100 Secret Senses is almost an undefined term, because it leaves open the possibilities of many things.
Right, well, you've covered most of what you've just answered in your speech, of course.
Thank
Marion?
Amy, is it all right if I call you Amy?
Yes,
Yeah?
please.
Okay, thanks.
Marion.
I hope the distance is okay. So I'm
Yes.
not used to it. The first time I read the Joy Luck Club several times, but the first time I read the book was I was in a car. My husband was driving. We were driving to France, and you made me cry. You made me laugh. And I could not stop reading aloud. I wanted to read aloud all the nice parts, but it meant that I was reading the book aloud the whole trip. And then I wanted to read it another time to have the emotions on my own, for myself. I gave the book to my sister because I thought this is a real book. Indonesian, Dutch women, daughters, second generation, people should read. My sister was crazy about it. She gave it her daughters. They loved it too. I gave it to my mother. I thought also the Indonesian, Dutch mothers should read it. My mother loved it. I gave it to my mother-in-law, who is a typical Dutch woman. She loved it. And then I heard everybody loved it. And I really wanted to meet you, and finally it happens, because that was exactly the book I wanted to read when I was 15, 16 years old. And I read one book after the other. I loved reading, but I never found that book. And finally, I got it. So I want to thank you for that. And I read the other books, your other books as well, and I love these as well. But I wonder how it is for you, because for me, the first book was important, because I think the first book is a book you're writing your whole life, your youth already, without realizing. Is that the same for you? Is the Joy Luck Club more special to you than the other two books?
In a way, it will always be very special to me, because in writing it, I discovered not only the reasons why I wanted to write, but who I wanted to be as a human being. That was, to me, the wonderful thing about being a writer, that you have this privilege, this time to simply sit and think about what's important in life, and write stories and change unhappy endings that you had in your life, or revisit them and become the character that you felt had wronged you, and make that character sorry if you want, but then realizing suddenly why that character had done something, and that character was a lot like your mother, and finding a lot of discoveries about myself. And yet those characters are not who I am necessarily. So it was very special, as you say, you know, that first book. It is all the questions that I've had in life, the conflicts. There's always a temptation to use the first book as a way to retaliate against, you know, the wounds that you've had, the people who've wounded you. I think in the end it became a vehicle for me to forgive myself for many things.
Yeah. And is it so that, did you have any public in mind writing it? How did it start? You said it started with stories, the
Yes,
book.
yeah.
And yesterday you told me without realizing that it was going to be a novel, huh?
Right. Well, I started writing one story because I was a business writer and I was not really satisfied with what I was doing because I had very nice clients and they were all very wonderful to me, but I did not love, for some reason, the world of telecommunications or account management, and it was not my driving force in life. And with stories, I could simply write what I wanted. I went actually to a psychiatrist to overcome my problems of why I couldn't stop writing about things I didn't like. And the psychiatrist 3 times fell asleep during the sessions. And he wouldn't give me my money back either. So I decided to leave him and write fiction instead. I could have become, you know, a very emotionally disturbed person with a very low self-esteem, you know, still seeing this man who would be snoring. He actually, you know, it's very disconcerting when you're a writer and you're in a public and you see somebody, especially in the front row, and they're going like this, you know. And to be the person sitting there and have only one person in the room and you're paying that person and you're watching their eyes roll back of their head.
He nevertheless encouraged you to write this beautiful book.
In that way, yes, he did. I should dedicate a book to him. And saved me a lot of money, too.
Yeah.
$100 and something an hour, you know. Yeah. So.
I'll come up with. I feel sorry to ask you these questions that people tend to ask me, and I never know what to answer. But I hope you have an answer for me. But isn't it that, you know, doesn't it change after the first book? Because the first book, yeah, you don't realize people are going to read and write about it, and you don't know about all the things that are going on, and then to write a second book, and yeah.
I cracked 3 teeth trying to write my second book. I had so much anxiety and I was grinding my teeth so much. It was that pressure suddenly of, well, why did they like the first book? You know, what am I supposed to do? You know, where are those parts and how can I duplicate them again? Or maybe I have to do something completely different and prove that I'm not a one-theme writer, or that I can write other than Chinese-American characters, that I can write about a German woman living in Amsterdam or something. And it's not only the expectations, it's trying to dispel the expectations. So I did probably 7 half-starts at novels and abandoned them all before I came up with The Kitchen God's Wife. And The Kitchen God's Wife was the suggestion of my mother. The whole time she was saying, you know, next time, write my true story. I mean, most parents get mad when you write a first book and they feel you've revealed these family secrets, and how could you, you know, and your grandmother's turning over in her grave. But my mother felt I had made up everything. No. And everybody thought that was our life, and it wasn't. So next book, I should tell the true story. And she asked me this, and I kept saying, that's not how you write fiction. You don't take people's stories and then record them. And then I realized, well, what is the reason why I write? It's really for very personal reasons, and I have to feel that the book, at the end of writing it, was worth it for what it was, that it doesn't matter if it gets badly reviewed or it never sells or anything, that I have to feel that the moment of writing was worth it. And what could I possibly do that's more important in life than finally I listened to my mother and tell her story and let her feel in the most absolute way I could possibly do that I had listened, I had empathized, I had understood completely what she had gone through. And that is the story of In the Kitchen God's Wife. Changed a great deal because I wanted my mother, if she had any regrets about telling me the story, to be able to say with complete honesty that no, it's fiction. And it is. A lot of it has changed. But the emotional things of what happened are absolutely true. My mother, in fact, when she read only part of the book, and she said that I made the bad man Wen Fu look too good. You know, here I had reviewers complaining that he was just archetypically so bad, he was unbelievable. My mother thought this was unbelievable because he was too good. And so...
you said your mother told you after the first book, now you write my real story. Did you feel that you had a kind of responsibility to the Chinese community in the United States, that you had, like, you had to tell or write their history or their inner thoughts? Yeah.
You know, I assume this is probably true for you, that when you're a writer of a different ethnic background, or you're bicultural, bi-ethnic, there is this assumption made in the States that you are doing something to educate people about culture. I don't think of myself as educating people. I think I'm writing a story, and it's a very specific story to those characters, and the characters are fictional, and the circumstances are fictional, and they are drawn in part from things that are disturbing me, things that confuse me, and I'm looking to make some sense of the world. But in no way am I an expert on culture. In no way am I trying to represent all of one culture. It's the antithesis of what I do as a fiction writer, and that is create very specific stories. The paradox is that when you create stories that are very specific and honest, sometimes you can tap into something that is universally true. But again, not representational, universally true on an emotional level. And this is the problem that, you know, I think writers of minority backgrounds have, is that people keep saying, oh, you know, this is our culture. No, this is not. How dare she write this? Because that's not how my mother is. My mother doesn't speak in a broken English. My mother doesn't, you know, argue with shopkeepers. And I want to say, of course not. Nobody said that, you know. So I think there's a lot of discussion needs to happen in the future about what American literature is, rather than these subcategories of Asian American literature and African American literature. Because as long as we have those categories, I think we're going to continue to believe that those subcategories are supposed to do something different than what is expected of American literature.
And but then, nevertheless, what did it do to you when Maxim Hong Kingston, for example, came up with her first book? Were you more attached to that book than to any other American writer of that time who also wrote? Did it mean more to you? Were you kind of proud to?
Yeah, I was. You know, it was not simply because Maxine Hong Kingston was Chinese. It was because she was a woman. And at that point, in '76, which is when her book came out in the United States, there were not that many women writers in the literary canon. It was still all the dead white male writers in college, and then a few contemporaries, you know, Saul Bellow or somebody like that, Philip Roth. So I was proud to find that a woman writer had written such a wonderful, powerful book. And I remember Maxine, when I met Maxine Hong Kingston the first time, and I was telling her, you know, I couldn't believe that this person had written such a wonderful book. And she said, you know, what I really love about what you said is you said a person. And not a Chinese person and not a Chinese woman, but just a person. And I said, well, I think it's true. But I think it's also true that being Chinese and not having ever seen a book by another Chinese person, to read that first book, to find sensibilities that are similar, is gratifying.
I think you're an expert in finding the right way, or this incredible way of writing literature in a way that it's hard for me to say. Because the obvious in a culture can be invisible for people from the other culture, and the way you write, you make the obvious which is invisible for example, the obvious for Chinese culture, you make it visible where it was invisible for the non-Chinese people, I think. And I think it has a lot to do with the way you create your characters. For example, in your latest book, you have Quan and Olivia, and by making Olivia as a very modern Chinese-American woman who is absolutely not interested in her Chinese background, is irritated by it and doesn't want to believe all these things. And then Quan, this almost helpless, because she's just thrown there in this American society, so warm and so nosy, but so in such a sweet way. By using these two characters, you make it very easy for the non-Chinese reader to identify with, in the first place, with Olivia, but then to love Quan. And I have the feeling that either you or you ghost writers, and I start believing in ghosts now, really know how to push the right buttons to make somebody who's absolutely not interested in another culture, make him, grow open, make him grow interest for the other culture. And I want to know an honest answer. If it's really, if these are the ghosts behind you who do it, or if you're very aware of your structure, the structures in your books.
Both. You know, I'm not aware of the structure so much until the end, and yet I am aware of characters that may not be understandable to other people. And I'm not even talking about non-Chinese people, but just take a character like my mother. It was somebody I didn't particularly like for a long time in my life. I didn't admire her, didn't understand her, wasn't interested in her. She didn't speak English that well, she dressed funny, she had funny ideas, she was very nosy and intrusive, you know. And when I said in my talk, it's an act of subversion that I create on myself. By using imaginary characters, I get closer to the truth of burying my soul. And I find myself creating a character like Quan, who is unlike anybody else I know, unlike anybody else I would imagine you know. And yet, if you fall in love with that character, you think, why, she's not much different as a human being than anyone else. And it has nothing to do with her background or the way she talks or the way she dresses and where she came from, and the crazy notion that she might have had a past life, and the crazy notion that she is the embodiment of a drowned girl.
May I interrupt you?
Yes, please.
I have the. You said before, there was some question from the public. You said that you don't represent your characters don't represent you, but you represent your characters.
Right.
I still have the feeling that, I might be completely wrong, but I still have the feeling that Quan in the 100 Senses is somewhere there inside of you, and you give her a life. You brought her to life with this book, but actually it's somebody you've been hiding during your youth and your time, and now it was time to come up with her, and after the book was finished, it hurts to put her back somewhere. Or
I don't think she's gone. I think she's still part of my life. I don't think of her as me, though. You know, when I look at that character in the book, I think, to me, she is the most real character I've ever created. and yet I don't know anybody like her. I don't think of her as a part of me. I think of her as alongside me. I think she's always been alongside me. Sometimes if I had to, if I wanted to get on the wacky side, and I'd say, well, I think maybe she's my grandmother. My mother thinks that has always been the case with my writing, that because in the Joy Luck Club there were things that I wrote about that I couldn't have possibly have known. My mother had told me my grandmother was a widow and she had remarried and was the first wife of a rich man and she accidentally died. I took that story and changed it. I didn't think, well, why would she die accidentally? And I made her a fourth wife and that she committed suicide. And when my mother read the story, she said, how did you know your grandmother really was the fourth wife and that she killed herself? And after that, she, my mother thinks that my grandmother comes and stands there and does dictation. And I'm at the computer writing this story down. It's kind of like a high-tech Ouija board, And, it goes back to her belief that I always a medium. And maybe my mother is partly right, because these ideas that Kwan comes up with, I don't know where they come from. The idea of the 100 secret senses, those are not things I've been, that's not my idea. That idea that she has that ghosts come back and criticize your cooking. I don't know where that came from. It surprises me, and so I end up feeling as though I have this person alongside me. It's actually very comforting, that and a little dog and a husband next to you in life. It's all you need,
But isn't it that part of you that you deny, that you try to neglect when you grow up in a society where you want to be like all the other ones, and that all, but in the subconscious it's living, it's still living,
right.
And you help.
Yeah, I think there is that secret part of me. I think every writer has secrets, and that is part of the compulsion to write. And you don't tell the secrets directly; you tell them in a code. The code is the story, and so in that way, yes, I suppose there's a part of me that is very much like Kwan. The willingness to believe in all possibilities, the desire to simply embrace everything without cynicism, without doubts, completely openly, just to see what would happen.
I still have time. Was it more difficult to write, to create the mother in the 100 Secret Senses than all the other mothers in your other two books? Or, for example, Kwan's mother?
Kwan's mother?
No, I mean Olivia's mother.
Yeah. Olivia's mother is a woman who was born in Moscow, Idaho. For those of you who don't know, she's not Chinese. She's a bit of everything fatty and fried. Heinz 57, and grew up twirling batons and winning a prize for growing a potato in the shape of Jimmy Durante's face. That mother actually came to me much later, because when I was writing this story, I suddenly realized it was about this woman, this character's search for love. And she didn't feel that she was rejecting Kwan's love, her unconditional love. She was feeling the love from her husband, Simon, was inadequate, that he would never love her as number one. Americans have this big thing about numbers, where you are in a list, 1, 2, 3. You have to be number one, Super Bowl wife. So she has yet rejected this love from her sister. And so I ended up realizing I needed to create a mother, that her feeling she never got enough love from her mother. Yeah. That she had this bottomless reservoir, and her mother gave all her attention to Yorkie rescue and dog pee and homeless and this and that, and didn't have time for her, that she was unreliable. So I went back actually and created the mother after I discovered what the emotional thread of my story was. And I created a mother. I think in my mind it's a mother who's a very nice person, and she's interesting. She dates foreign exotic men. She and she's nice. She's a volunteer, you know, but she's a little unreliable. She's not terribly motherly.
No, not at all, I think.
Yeah.
And
right.
Olivia's constantly complaining about the lack of love of her mother. It's
yes.
a big burden for her. Now, I hardly dare to ask this question. But is it coincidence? But you said something about coincidence before. Is it coincidence, or is it also very important for the story that this mother is non-Chinese?
The mother is not Chinese for another reason, because Olivia is somebody who is biracial. She's half and half, and yet she is somebody who's trying to find out who she belongs to. And it becomes a question of identity, and she looks at it in a larger way of, you know, she's trying to decide what name she's going to take after she divorces. Yi, or, you know, Laguni, which was her stepfather's name, or whatever. And so I needed to have somebody, that the whole issue of identity becomes much more rich, complex, when you are of two backgrounds. And the mother ends up becoming non-Chinese, to give Olivia that dichotomy. What she discovers in the question of who do I belong to has not so much to do with her cultural, racial background, her country. It has to do with love. And the sister, who in the end, you don't even know if she really was her sister. Oh.
Now, thank you for this. Now I go into another field which we already mentioned a little bit, and you did yourself. That's if you are a writer of a minority group, and then I think you said it before, then people always tend to think that if the character is also part of that minority group, that they assume it to be autobiographic. Does this happen to you? And what do you think if it does? And I think you said it does. What's the reason?
I recall. I think that's true. You know, I think it's as though people think you're recording social history. That your reasons for writing have less to do with imagination as they do with some sort of responsibility to record your people's history, so to speak, your family history. And that does happen. I have people, for example, who say, "Are you sure you can walk that distance?" And I think, what do you mean? You know, can you walk by yourself? And they say, you know, I mean, is the multiple sclerosis, is it bad? And I say, I don't have multiple sclerosis. And they say, but in the book, you know, you have. I said, yeah, it's a book. And then they say, well, who's taking care of your daughters? And I said, what daughters? Your two daughters. You said you have two daughters. I said, I have a character who had two daughters. I don't have two daughters. I have a dog. Or they'll say, you know, I don't blame you for divorcing your husband. I divorced mine for the same reason. I said, what reason was that? Because I haven't divorced mine yet. You know, it's strange, and I don't know if it's an assumption people automatically would make, say, of John Updike or Sue Grafton or, you know, Ann Beatty or something, but it tends to be placed upon minority writers that what you're writing is documentation. And I think with this book, I kept waiting for somebody to ask me if this book was autobiographical, because then I could say, yes, Miss Banner was me. This is an autobiography of my past life as a floozy from the 1850s.
I think it's time, but you told me to stop at 10:15, and it's exactly that.
Well, I would like to ask a question, if I may. Yeah, a final question, I think. About your film, the film of the Joy Luck Club, how did you enjoy working in that medium, that different medium? Or were you satisfied with the outcome of the film? Because you
Yes.
helped write the script, you wrote the screenplay.
Yes.
You helped produce the film.
Yes.
How was that?
It was a wonderful experience, a wonderfully creative experience. Learning, for one thing, that film and novels are very, very different. And you cannot, I mean, people always say, well, the film can never be like the book. And yes, it never can be because they are two different media. A film goes by at such a clip, and you must tell your story within 2 hours, or hopefully less. A book, you have time to ruminate. You have time to take digressions, necessarily so. You know, I mean, the melodrama of a scene can be lightened by reflection, introspection, the creation of ironies. You don't have that luxury in a film, and yet what you have is dramatization, impact, things that are images on paper that seem sketchily done and can be filled in by the reader's own imagination are fully realized in image on the screen. And so you have to think about these differences. And that makes it a very creative challenge, a very exciting one, to see what you can translate from the book into a film. And what we decided, what I learned from working with Ron Bass, the screenwriter, the other screenwriter, and Wayne Wang, is that you must take what is emotionally the essence of the book and try to find a sibling to that. You cannot create a twin, you can create a sibling that carries the same emotional genetics, but is different, its own creation. And you must look then at each scene and find its dramatic point, which is different from a chapter, different from a story. And I learned a lot, actually, creatively about scenes, about emotions, and what I love about writing, why I will always prefer writing novels rather than making movies. I loved working with these people and all that, but believe me, you know, nobody's going to tell you you can't have 1,000 angels dancing on the head of the pin because it costs too much. You can write in anything you want. Battles, you know, whatever. Mothers that, you know, that are not glamorous. You didn't have to worry that the mother is going to age 40 years and you need to use the same actress, you know. So there are this practical world of business and, you know, money with films. We do have interest in making a film of the other books, and I'm supposed to be working on that now, but I have this reluctance because it's at least 2.5 years out of my life to write the book, and that means you don't have time to write fiction. And that's what I love to do. I love the isolation. I love the time. I love having my dog sit in my lap as I type into the typewriter as my grandmother dictates her stories to me.
Thank you, Ben.